Hi, my name is Hee-hyun, and I'm a graduate student in the MA design program. And today I'm going to introduce Sana Sharma. She's a designer and she's a researcher who brings science and tech out of the lab and into the world. She's currently serving as a co-founder at the Aurelia Institute, and she's also a research affiliate at the MIT Space Exploration Initiative. And she just got married last weekend. So yeah, welcome, Sana Sharma. Congrats.
Alrighty, I'm not quite as tall as our last speaker. And what a tough act to follow on both counts. Can we give another round of applause for those fantastic talks? Amazing. All right, everybody. Hello. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Sana, and I design and build experiences that connect people with emerging technologies. I've taken a fairly circuitous path to where I am today that I'd love to walk you through. In terms of the work that I've done over the past decade plus in design and emerging tech, I started off with a background in architecture and physics, so I know just enough science to be dangerous these days, and pivoted all over the place from healthcare and AI to quantum computing, a little bit of Gen AI visual applications to where I work today in space. I've always had this early fascination with science and art and this idea of the future and who gets a seat at the table when we build it. Because it's the Wild West out there, and that's something I don't think I need to tell this audience or belabor in too much detail. The rate of pace when it comes to tech innovation and scientific development feels like it's accelerating, and we are all along for the ride. And my hope in this short talk for you today is to convince you all to be active participants and agents of change, as opposed to folks who are sort of taking it in passively and reactively. There's a lot of really good work that we get to do. Now, in the spirit of show not tell, what I'd love to do today is to walk you through some of the questions I've been asking as part of my career, all the way from undergrad through where I am now and where those questions have taken me across the many domains that I have had the privilege of working in. And that first question is a question that a mentor asked me just as I was graduating from undergrad. I had started off as an astrophysics major, ended up with an architecture degree, was fairly uncertain about what I was going to do with my life with those two skills and a smattering of anthropology mixed in. But I had taken some coursework in human-centered design and really loved it. Didn't really understand that UX was a profession I could enter. That word was still maybe growing its legs. And a mentor asked me to go find places where the kind of work I wanted to do was mission critical. And where I initially found that was, of all places, IBM, a fairly legacy brand, but one that was undergoing a tremendous change in terms of bluntly the number of designers they were bringing on staff. I believe at the time I was recruited, they were aiming to go from a ratio of about 1 designer to 80 developers down to 1 designer to 7 to 8. So a tremendous volume in hiring, but all a part of this goal of modernizing the business as well as leveraging design as a strategic process. And that was really cool to me. How might we as, advocates for human beings really integrate ourselves into some of these gorpy, complex technical situations and make systems that don't suck to use, that are actually really enjoyable and meaningful, safe and reliable. And it was here at IBM that I got my first flavor of integrating emerging tech into a domain, in this case, integrating IBM Watson, which had just won at Jeopardy, into healthcare and seeing how those two big forces played with each other. This was a fantastic bread and butter UX design and research job. You had a really complicated healthcare ecosystem. You had federal regulations. You had compliance issues. All of our favorite stuff, right? Right, yeah. And I really loved being able to sort of figure out how we might be able to leverage these technologies to actually provide some tangible benefits to the folks working in healthcare, trying to make sense of the sheer amounts of data coming in order to make good health-related decisions. And I won't belabor this too much, but the other thing I got to learn as part of this experience is that as we as designers on this particular project were brought in fairly late into the process, initially tasked with creating an interface, a wrapper, for the machine learning microservices that had been pre-developed by research, what we found during research and development of our own is that the things that had been built prior to us didn't actually solve human problems. They were really cool, they were really fancy, they did not do the things that the people who were going to use them needed them to do, and they weren't trustworthy. They actually also weren't FDA compliant, which made my job of trying to convince people to change their minds on a couple of things a little bit easier. But we hit upon the perennial concerns of AI and tech development that I'm sure you all have heard, have felt, and will continue to feel in this day and age. The sort of threefold value of trust, transparency, and feedback. When integrating these new, complex, opaque technologies into what people do, how do we make things that are actually valuable to them, meet their expectations, are worthy of their trust? So after playing a couple of years of damage control, getting a product and experience into ship shape when it comes to leveraging these technologies, I really mulled on that question of, well, if I don't want to be playing catch up with my career, where could I as a designer sit in the R&D ecosystem in order to have the best, the most, have meaningful impact in the way that was important to me? That brought me to another business unit at IBM, to IBM Quantum. And this was really exciting because it was one of the first times within IBM research, which had traditionally been you need, a PhD in order to get through the door. The first time those of us without that skill set, designers, software developers and engineers, business folks, were being invited at the ground floor to work with research scientists on their technology. I was brought on as a UX design lead for the quantum projects, and what we were able to do was embed directly with the research scientists in order to try to find ways to make their technology more accessible to a wider audience. So let's take something that requires a PhD in quantum information science and turn it to something that you or I might be able to play with and get a handle of, as a first step of making this technology commercially viable. So education first as a lead. And that required a fair amount of building of trust. I would say the research team was a little bit hesitant to work with us back in the day. There's a lot of math involved in quantum computing, which is not a surprise to any of you, I'm sure. And a lot of the precedent we were brought in with in terms of the representations of states and programs looked a lot like this. So some low-hanging fruit for our, graphic and communications design folks, but also a fair amount of really rich context embedded in some of these esoteric, somewhat Byzantine designs. And a first way we built some trust was to take some of this existing work, some of this visual language, and make it our own in terms of leveraging IBM Design's language, working with the research scientists to figure out what they were actually trying to learn from each of these diagrams or representations, what they were doing in the research papers, and then build digital versions that allowed them to analyze their work in real time. So talking with folks about what they needed, what they were trying to glean at a glance, what they were drilling down into, and build prototypes that they could play with in order to have better conversations with them. And I'd say the important thing here is that these initial visualizations were data rich. One of my jobs, given my 3/4 of a physics degree from undergrad, was to attempt to read research papers and build a data rich representation of a quantum state. Now, it was always wrong. Let's be absolutely clear here. I am not an expert in quantum mechanics, but it was right enough for us to have a conversation with our researchers that went beyond the superficial. They're like, oh, that's pretty, those colors are nice, or my God, I have no idea what that is because it is so incorrect. We landed in that sweet spot where creation is hard, but critique is a little easier. And so we started to have much more productive, much more in-depth conversations with our research colleagues to drill down and to actually get to have some fun inventing visualizations of our own. And actually collaborating with research and development to create new ways of representing information for our quantum suite or quantum toolkits that we were building at the time. I won't go too deep into this, but one of the things I absolutely loved was that trust that we initially built on the visualization side meant that we could really go for broke when it came to a redesign and overhaul of the Quantum Composer, which was effectively a proof of concept platform or web app, effectively, that allowed someone to use a quantum computer from the cloud. This had been built, I think, in 2014 or 2015, was wildly popular. I think initially it was built as an internal tool, but then garnered a fair amount of use from enthusiasts. And IBM wanted to open source this. They wanted to build a web platform that allowed anyone to be able to use their quantum computer on the internet for free for a certain degree. The trust that we were able to build in terms of working with the research team meant that we were given the mandate to go and talk to not only them, but also to scientists, physicists, engineers, computer scientists, students, quantum enthusiasts who knew nothing about quantum computing but thought it was really cool, and learn from them in terms of how they'd played with this tool and what kinds of things they were looking for. And what we found is that even though their backgrounds and their use cases differed, the fundamental capabilities they were looking into, they wanted, had some really strong commonalities. Being able to compare results, being able to have a history of what you've done, most importantly, being able to simulate what you're going to get out of a quantum computer. A fundamental difference between your traditional binary, where you have a yes and a no, and a quantum computer, where it's not quite that simple, means that being able to run experiments multiple times, run programs multiple times, and compare results is a great learning tool. But what we found was that people were a little bit gun shy to use these tools. There were certain credits that you needed. They didn't want people to just sort of spam the quantum computer. Makes sense. But folks felt pretty precious about what they were working on. And so giving them a way to simulate what results might look like, or might look like on average, helped build the trust and the muscle memory for them to leverage these tools more robustly over time, and to build the knowledge they'd need to actually use quantum computing for their work. And the exciting thing is that by being able to do this, those previous screens were, and for you, OGs out there, that was part of a 240 screen InVision prototype that we built in order to communicate our design work to the VPs at our company, in order to convince them to give us the resources to build it. Rest in peace, InVision. We miss you. I miss you. What that allowed us to do was to collaborate with the research team, not only on the interface, but on the capabilities themselves. We filed a utility patent together, design, development, and research, in order to pull all of this together. And this exists today. If you guys want to, please, after this presentation, you can go on the internet and run a program on a quantum computer. That resource is available for folks to play with for free, which is really, really exciting. So, working in education and open source was a real joy. But as I got pulled into grad school, I wanted to build up some sort of technical skill sets, build up my chops a little bit. A question did linger in the back of my mind based on these experiences that I'll talk to briefly in the next little bit, and that is effectively how do I as a designer have the kind of impact I want to have in R&D. I'd been really good at boots on the ground, but there was this overall strategy layer that I was really curious about in terms of what sort of true co-creation or development might look like on the scientific forefront. And then there was this sort of nagging idea of the future. Where do we draw inspiration from when imagining and building the future? Where are these innovators pulling their ideas from to begin with? This question really nagged at me as during graduate school, I joined a group called the Space Exploration Initiative at the Media Lab. I was at another uni, but I got recruited over initially to do mission patch design, and then I ended up doing some research with them. This is a grassroots org at MIT whose main goal is to make more accessible the sort of pathway to launch when it comes to designing and building things for space. The goal is to prototype our sci-fi space future, and boy, did we prototype. We'll get there in a minute. I think we have about 40 or 50 in-house projects, as well as a bunch of work we support across the university. And I got really inspired by just how much sci-fi I was seeing get built in real time with these fantastic engineers, delightful nerds that I got to work with every day. And that sci-fi connection was really interesting. Sometimes it was incredibly compelling to see something that you'd imagined or seen in a movie come to life. And sometimes you did have to ask the question of, hey, it feels like we're rehashing the tropes and ideas that themselves feel a little bit narrow, a little bit stale, a little bit outdated. Is this what we actually want? Is this what we actually need? At best, we'd see ideas that fell into the cool toy but doesn't address real human needs. And at worst, and for those of you who remember this old Twitter post, left an impression, sometimes it would make me wonder, have we taken the wrong lessons from sci-fi itself? Are we building things that we shouldn't be building? Are we getting inspiration superficially from some of these sources? And so this was the initial impetus, at least for my space work, on the astronaut ethnography project, whose goal is to learn about daily life in space from people who've been there beyond the confines of the mission. When you interview an astronaut, when you talk to them about their work, they're going to talk about the EVAs, their spacewalks, they're going to talk about the research. But less common are the stories of what daily life is like. But that stuff is incredibly important if the goal is to make space more accessible for folks who are not the 0.001% of humanity, the most resilient folks on Earth. We had the immense privilege of being able to interview individuals who'd been to space from all around the world. We also supplemented that with hundreds of diary entries and journal entries when it comes to daily experiences in space. And, oh boy, I might be running out of time, but I'll tell a couple quick stories on this. Rather than talking you through methods, though if you enjoy research methods, please come talk to me. I love methods. I'll tell you a couple stories about what we've learned. Some of them are expected in terms of zero-G as a medium changes the body in space. We've heard of fluid retention changes. We've heard of changes in smell and perception. I think my favorite is why Ron McNair here is wearing those groovy acorn socks while playing a saxophone, which is an incredible photo in and of itself. In space, rather than stepping on the ground, you are holding yourself in place by hooking your foot over a railing, which means you develop calluses over the tops of your feet and not the bottom. And so you actually need soles on the tops of your shoes and not the bottoms of your shoes. This is a really small example, but you'll see ways in which astronauts are already prototyping methods, whether wearables or environmental, to make zero-G as a living space more comfortable for them. That creativity and improvisation is very much part and parcel of life because not everything was anticipated when we built the International Space Station or its predecessors. I think my favorite quote from an interview is, "A piece of tape is a table." Which was really useful when you think about it. You don't need a table to have substance or heft the way this podium does. It just needs to be sticky. Anything sticky could be a table. And that means you have so much space, so much real estate around you if you have a flat, sticky surface to keep track of things, which is really important because it's really, really easy to lose things in space. If I were to drop something, it's not going to fall to the ground. It's going to float somewhere, anywhere. Lots has been lost on the ISS and may never be found in terms of what people do up there. I think the favorite research concept that came up was this idea of food altruism and diplomacy. Food's really important, not only for us as human beings on Earth, but also in orbit. It's one of the few ways we connect with each other when sharing a meal together. You provide a bit of self-comfort and care. It's important nutritionally. This is astronaut Peggy Whitson showing off hamburger night on the ISS. They use tortillas instead of bread because breadcrumbs are incredibly flammable. But this idea of food altruism and diplomacy I really loved in a space as international as the International Space Station. Some crews, and this was often self-organized, would collect all of the tea and coffee and sweets that they received from their various respective home countries, pool them all together, and then divvy them out equally so that crews felt like they were all getting to participate in the fun little treats in life. My favorite finding from another research paper is in order to make astronauts' lives a little better, given that you're doing somewhat monotonous work in a very extreme, sometimes dangerous environment, is to hide snacks. Genuinely, there is a line in a research paper that says, "Hide snacks for astronauts to find, it will make their day." And it does. But this idea of sharing food as a way of building camaraderie as well as building cultural connection turns out to be incredibly valuable. There's a high premium on hot sauce and condiments. And when commanders change the guard, often the hot sauce is passed along with responsibilities because flavor is king in space, as it is on Earth. Last thing I'll quickly mention, art, craft, and care. It turns out humans want to be human regardless of where they are, and there are so many examples from music to craft and quilting to calligraphy to painting of astronauts taking the time to connect with themselves, with others, with their sense of place and home through artistic endeavors. All of what we have learned was incredibly valuable in imagining, in not only learning from how people are already adapting to their environments in this slightly more holistic, a little less sort of engineering human factors kind of way, but also in imagining ways in which we might improve upon or build new experiences to address some of those core desires. And that really found its way into our SEI prototyping. And it's also something that we have been doing our absolute best to open source. I'm an open source gal. It's what I do. This is a website where we've been taking all of our synthesized research, various forms of our research papers, as well as some of those insights themselves, the sort of juicy stories that end up on the cutting room floor, in order to make designing for zero-G as an environment a little bit more accessible, given it is such a rarefied space and given that we have had a tremendous privilege of getting to work with these folks. We're hoping to share that work as much as possible. It's at the URL lifeinspace.org, which is hopefully easy to remember. It is a beta. We're working on it, but bear with us as we add more content to this because we're really excited to see what creative people like you are able to do when thinking about zero-G as a new medium to play in. Now, I know I'm really going over time. I'm looking at Andrew. How are we doing? Okay. Last thing, I promise. Now, we've been really, really fortunate on the research side at MIT to be able to work with these folks, but I would be remiss if I didn't practice what I preach. And so the question that I've been mulling on these days has been, okay, based on what we've learned, what would it truly take to make space feel like home? Because again, we know what the inside of the ISS looks like. I've heard metaphors from it's like sleeping at your desk in the office to living in your car for 6 months without rolling down the windows. It's tough in there, and we can do better. But oftentimes, again, the imaginings of what these worlds, what these interiors could look like are so heavily drawn on sci-fi that is stark, white, homogeneous, sterile. I love this movie, so no critique here. But I think there's a lot more space to play, particularly if we start pulling from places outside of your traditional Western canon when it comes to imaginings of the future. So this is part of what I do is at my day job at Aurelia Institute. We have been working on the R&D side, a technology called Tesserae. It's spun out of our CEO and my co-founder, Ariel Ekblaw's PhD thesis research on modular self-assembling space architecture. And simply the way it works is it involves a series of tiles with electropermanent magnets that encircle them. And so they stack flat into the payload fairing of a rocket, get launched into a zero-G environment, and then through the use of those electropermanent magnets, as well as some computing, semi-stochastically self-assemble into these large soccer ball shapes, or truncated icosahedrons for you geometry nerds out there. The goal is that you're able to attach these soccer balls together over time, essentially accrete and grow a space station organically rather than using the what I'd call tin can method of space station design. The ideal is, if we do our jobs right, we might be able to reuse and pack down some of that material as well. But how do you make a space like that? How do you leverage that real estate to feel like a home? This is what I work on the architecture side of space architecture, where we've been designing not only interiors, but also essentially research artifacts or experiments, full-scale prototypes that we might be able to test in varying ways for what we might want in those interiors to make human beings not only healthy and productive, but also happy and fulfilled, raising the bar on what the status quo for human beings in space should be. You're seeing a couple of things here in terms of our green vault, as well as our experiments in fermentation. Again, flavor is king in space, and fermentation is a great way for develop both healthy, nutritious, shelf-stable food. And we have had the great privilege of taking some of that work at full-scale space architecture, again, designed for Earth these days. This guy isn't going to orbit. But to give a sense of the scale and the design ideas here, we've been able to take this on the road. Our first stop was as part of the Home Beyond Earth exhibition at the Seattle Museum of Flight. We got a little spot of honor in the atrium, which I feel tremendously blessed to have been part of. And we got to bring those research artifacts onto display. And again, I know I'm running short on time, but I will play one audience participation game here. And you guys thought audience participation was done. It is not. But this one's fun, I promise. So you can see this large structure over here to my left, the left side of the screen. What do we think this is? That's my question. There are no wrong guesses. Every response to this I have heard, I have learned something. Couch, I like it. What else do we got? What else could this be? Art, I like it, yeah. A garden, ooh, that is fascinating. Excellent, excellent. I want a couple more. Lighting fixtures, excellent, excellent. Say that again? Fascinating, compost? Awesome. No, I'm here for it. That is wonderful. Alrighty, I am shocked, but the first guess was what we were aiming for. Though something we've learned is that letting people reflect on what we've produced design-wise has been really fun fodder for future iterations of what we build. This is our version of a zero-G couch. Now, clearly there's no seat to sit, but if you think about it in microgravity, there is no gravity to let you collapse back onto a couch after a long day. You don't get that satisfaction of sitting down on a chair. Oftentimes you have to be strapped in. And so we wondered, rather than strapping people into places or using Velcro, were there other references we might be able to pull from to give people that innate sense of comfort? And we pulled from essentially sea anemones and clownfish. So the idea is, like a little clownfish, you nestle into the anemones there. You get enough sort of hug in that space that you can get yourself comfortable. You can have a buddy over, you can sit. But you get the feeling of comfort and security despite losing the 1G sort of warmth that comes with the ability to sit down and get comfy. To this end, we have been tremendously lucky to be able to prototype this in full scale and get, I think, over 9,000 people to come through the space in the first 5 or 6 months of folks visiting at the Seattle Museum of Flight. We have learned a tremendous amount from bringing folks into the space, doing workshops, having folks as young as 5, as old as 65, Girl Scouts, designers, engineers, science folks, people in the museum who needed a sensory-friendly space for their toddler. We have learned a tremendous amount from this experience of building and iterating, and we're really looking forward to integrating what we've learned and, asking and answering subsequent questions. So that's the plan at this point. We have our small spaceflight hardware at this stage. This is an image of our Gen 3 tiles aboard the International Space Station in the cupola to test out how it works. But the goal is to build big. And so how we draw the line between our small prototypes and our proof of concept scale into something that, truly can scale with us and our ambitions in orbit to allow for and enable fantastic scientific research, advancement, other uses and use cases in space has been where I'm at in terms of answering the questions that I posed to you. The last one I'll leave you with is this one, which has been overarching as I've been mulling over. One of the benefits of Pavilion, one of the benefits of a lot of the open source science I've worked on over the past several years is to try to answer this question of who gets a seat at the table. I find the bigger the table, the more folks who participate, the more interesting and eclectic and fascinating the ideas are, the better the results. And I would strongly advocate that design, particularly the people in this room, are incredibly well positioned to make contributions, whether that's in translation or speculative design, product and product requirement, brand and marketing, as we've heard from our other speakers. There's tremendous good work to be done out there, and I'm very excited to see what you all do. So thank you.